Welcome, welcome everyone, and many thanks for joining us for this event hosted by the University of Bath's Institute for Policy Research. My name is Matt Dixon. I'm a Professor of Economic and Social Policy at the IPR, and I'm delighted to be joined this evening by Professor Simon Burgess, Evelyn Ford, MBE, and Jack Worth. Together, we'll be discussing the current teacher recruitment and retention crisis and thinking about what policymakers might be able to do to improve the situation. In a moment, I'm going to invite each of our speakers to offer their initial remarks. Then we'll open up the discussion, and then there will be opportunity for questions. Do please be putting your questions in using the Q&A function in Zoom. But first of all, let me more formally introduce our panel. Simon Burgess is Professor of Economics at the University of Bristol and a Fellow of the British Academy. He's Programme Director for Economics of Education at the Institute for the Study of Labour in Bonn, and was previously the Director of both the Centre for Market and Public Organisation from 2004 to 2014, and also the Centre for Understanding Behaviour Change from 2010 to 2014. In addition to this, Simon was also the Independent Chair of the Board of the Somerset Challenge from 2016 to 2017, which was a locally funded school improvement initiative. Welcome, Simon. Evelyn Ford, MBE, is an experienced teacher and an award-winning school leader. She recently served as the president of the Association of School and College Leaders, and from 2016 to 2023 was head teacher at Copthall's School in Mill Hill, North London. During this time, she led the school to achieve significantly improved outcomes and worked with the staff to secure a range of accolades for the school. In November 2020, Evelyn was awarded the prestigious TES Head Teacher of the Year Award and received an MBE Services to Education in the 2021 New Year's Honours List. Welcome, Evelyn. And last but by no means least, we have Jack Worth, who is the School Workforce Lead at the National Foundation for Educational Research. His research aims to understand changes in the recruitment, retention, development and diversity of teachers in the UK. He's a specialist in analysing large data sets, including labour force survey and the school workforce census, and he uses statistical analysis to gain insights for policy and practice, and is widely regarded as the leading authority in the country on the data relating to teacher recruitment and retention. Welcome, Jack. And it's Jack that I'm going to invite to kick us off with some data-inspired thoughts on the current teacher recruitment and retention situation in England. Thanks, Jack.
Thanks very much, Matt. Thanks very much, Matt. Did the same as you. It's wonderful to be here talking about this important topic, teachers, at this time when recruiting and retaining enough teachers is really difficult in England. I think so. It's important to have enough teachers. It's just a fundamental need in our system of any well-functioning school system, is to have enough teachers to deliver the quality education for pupils. And if we have shortages of qualified teachers, then it means that schools and school leaders are trying to make do with either expensive supply teachers or deploying non-specialist teachers to teach certain subjects, or burdening existing staff with more workload. So there's a real imperative to make sure that there are enough teachers to deliver high quality education. But we also know that when there's a national squeeze on teacher supply, it affects the schools serving disadvantaged communities the most. So it matters just as much for social mobility as much as it does for the educational performance of the nation. So in terms of what's been going on, and the reason why we're so concerned about it at the moment is that recruitment to teacher training has been particularly poor for a number of years. It improved slightly during the pandemic because the wider labour market kind of dried up in terms of opportunities, but teaching, it's always open. There's always pupils to teach. So it saw an increase during the pandemic, but since the pandemic, it's been particularly poor. So last year, secondary teacher training, there were the number of teachers recruited into teacher training was half what the government assessed that we need to come into the system. So this is really tricky, particularly for secondary schools. And it's partly a recruitment issue. We're just not recruiting enough teachers to meet that need. And it's particularly difficult in a competitive labour market like we've had since the pandemic, with shortages across the labour market. But it's not just a recruitment issue, it's also the retention issue. It's the same, the other side of the teacher supply coin. So we currently lose 10% of teachers every year. And if we weren't losing quite so many, then we wouldn't need to recruit quite so many. And that's part of what's led us into this difficulty. But it's also being driven, it is a supply issue, but it's also being driven by demand factors. So the fact that we need so many more secondary teachers is being driven by increases in pupil numbers, while primary pupil numbers are falling. So it's particularly affecting secondary, and particularly affecting some subjects which have always been difficult to recruit for, like maths and science and modern foreign languages. So what are the drivers of some of these supply issues? I think there are some key ones that are worth thinking about. So there are teacher shortages, teacher under recruitment in other countries, but it's certainly the case that England stands out as having teachers that work high working hours, have high workload, stress, low job satisfaction, and higher leaving rates, which is why, as a result, we have one of the youngest teaching workforces in the OECD. And workload is one of those really key drivers of retention. So it's really important driver of what we're seeing in retention. But pay and financial attractiveness of teaching is also really, really important. And we've seen the pay of teachers has grown more slowly over time since 2010 than salaries outside of teaching. So the competitiveness of teaching has become less. So it's less financially attractive to enter and to stay in as a profession than it was, which is surely affecting recruitment and retention. There are a number of subject-specific kind of bursaries and early career payments and other financial incentives around, and we have pretty good evidence that those are highly effective, but they're just not operating at the scale required to either undo the effect of reducing that pay in competitiveness or resolving the kind of overall challenges that we're facing. And then since the pandemic, we also face another big challenge, which is attracting teachers to enter and stay in teaching. And that always means competing with other professions. And actually what we've seen is that the graduate labour market outside of teaching has been transformed by the pandemic. So here we are all at home, chatting to each other on Zoom, which was quite a few years ago. So hybrid working is something that's really valued by people, but isn't the sort of thing that's on offer to frontline professionals like teachers. So we need to kind of grapple with how we're going to deal with that change and keep teaching just as competitive as it always was. But that's all quite negative about teaching. And I just wanted to end on a positive in terms of talking about teaching as a really wonderful, important, significant profession. It gives people the opportunity to work with young people and have a significant impact on opportunities and life chances. Data that we look at shows that teachers have a greater sense of things that they do are worthwhile compared to other graduates and people in other professions. So it's really important that we also value teachers and talk up the teachers, and really as a society and government should treasure and value the teachers that we've got, and also try to make teaching as attractive a profession as we possibly can, because we need the talented, skilled, and supported and motivated teachers to deliver a great education for young people.
Well, thank you, Jack. Thank you for bringing in the kind of positive at the end and reminding, because you know, amongst the talk that we're going to be having about this crisis in recruitment and retention, it is really important to remember that teaching professionals, do have these high levels of job satisfaction, that there are, you know, something very rewarding about working with young people, and there's a lot of positives. So thank you, Jack, for sounding that note. Let me now come to Evelyn, and perhaps you can give us your reflections as someone who's been at the coalface of teacher recruitment and retention and these sorts of issues around workload, etc., that Jack has been talking about?
Yeah, sure. And thank you for having me. I just want to kind of go back a little bit to what Jack was saying, however, and it's a positive and it's a negative. The positive is that Jack and his team have just done some fantastic work on ethnic diversity in the teaching workforce. But the negative is they are underrepresented in the teaching workforce, and they too are leaving in droves. So there's kind of another strand to the whole teacher recruitment and retention when you have a lens on that. And I just want to say that's a brilliant piece of work that's been done by NFER, and I didn't want to miss that. However, I can speak about this topic with kind of three hats on, really. Number one, as a head teacher, and as you said, I left in August of last year, frontline headship, and I have to say that recruitment and retention was one of the biggest challenges that kept me up at night. There was plenty others, don't get me wrong, but the fact that I couldn't put a qualified teacher in front of my young people became really, really challenging, and just kind of added to the workload and the stress that school leaders have. A good example would be there was one time when I had 3 supply science teachers. That was in the core. I had to merge classes because we just didn't have enough teachers to teach our young people. That was just in the core. I also had supply, or trying to get supply, in other subjects as well. Staff retention became a real challenge. Many young teachers looking abroad. And I think we need to question, why are they going abroad? And we can see the cost of living crisis, particularly in the big cities. Living in London is a real challenge for young people, for everybody. And so the financial pressures are driving teachers and leaders away. And Jack mentioned the pay, and yes, many unions like ASCL, we fought hard for the pay increase, but it hasn't kept up with inflation. So there is something around pay. So when I had to sit down and think, well, why are people leaving? And I kind of looked across the board, and yes, it's pay, yes, it's workload, yes, it's conditions of service. And then there's Ofsted as well, and I don't think we can shy away from that, particularly for many school leaders, because it had become a very punitive system, and that's driving teachers and school leaders out of the profession. I think some staff, not only were they moving abroad, but also moving to the private sector. That became quite attractive to some teachers. And I think we really need to consider and look at what can we do, or what can ministers do more proactively to look at workload, look at pay, look at conditions, look at Ofsted, etc. So that's my one hat with was my one hat being a head teacher. Last year, I chaired Education Supports Commission on teacher retention, and that was supported by Public First. And we undertook extensive polling exercises. We had focus groups and evidence sessions. And I just kind of want to share some stats with you, because we found them quite eye-watering and deeply concerning. Just a couple. 78% of teachers said they would be likely to leave the profession if they were offered a job in another sector, which promised a better work-life balance. And we've been talking about the pandemic and how organizations have been able to flex. As Jack said, we're here online and so on. That's a bit harder in the sector, but I think there's some work we can do looking around flexible working and what that looks like. We also found that more than 1 in 5 secondary school teachers said they were unlikely to be in the profession in 5 years' time. And I think what isn't done enough for our profession is celebrate it and really big us up as a profession. We get a lot of negativity coming from ministers behind closed doors. And, you know, if there was a bit more appreciation for the sector, that could go a long way, and that might kind of retain secondary school teachers from thinking about leaving. 72% of secondary teachers said they were helping students with non-academic matters relating to mental health. That, you know, the pressure on schools, teachers, non-teaching staff, just trying to support our young people, more so post-pandemic, you know, and we could have a whole session on CAMS and, you know, the services that we're all trying to carry, but that has had a negative impact. And I faced that like day in and day out when I was a head teacher. So that's my hat number 2. My final hat number 3 is as ASCL president last year and being able to talk on behalf of ASCL. You know, we hear on a daily basis the challenges that school and college leaders are facing around recruitment and retention. And I've mentioned, you know, the ones around workload pay and so on and so forth. And Jack has already alluded to the fact that we don't have enough trainee teachers coming through the system. And, you know, ASCL talks a lot about that with ministers, and we try to remind them that they've missed their targets, you know, and we've got shortages of teachers, huge deficits in maths, physics, computing, modern foreign languages, and head teachers are having to make those real difficult decisions about what should the curriculum look like. Of course, we need to offer a broad and balanced curriculum, but if you know that you have not got those teachers to teach those young people, where do you go with that? Finally, the supply of new teachers, just want to reiterate, is just simply inefficient, insufficient. We have not got the pipeline coming through. Teaching is not celebrated, and we're not recognised for the amazing work that happens in the schools, and so there's a piece of work to do there. So those are my 3 hats. Happy to have further discussions later on, but that's my input for now.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Evelyn. That's really, you've given us some really interesting food for thought with those different challenges and those different perspectives coming at the problem. Simon, if I can come to you for how do we solve all this, or no, I won't ask you to kind of solve all these problems, but just, you know, as someone who's worked on the teacher labour market for a decade or more, what's your kind of take on these issues?
So let me disabuse you immediately. I do not have the solution or necessarily even a solution. It's a hard problem. So, I mean, teachers, as our first 2 speakers have made very clear, teachers are very, very important. We know that from the research numbers, but also if anyone needed convincing, then, you know, the pandemic will have done that. When students were not allowed to be with their teachers, almost all of them suffered dreadfully in terms of their progress, their academic progress, their learning, and obviously separately also their mental health. So teachers are very, very important, and the teacher recruitment crisis is a really big, important problem. Professor Sandra McNally from Surrey and I had to write a piece on what are the biggest problems facing an incoming government, and we wrote a chapter on education, and that is and was our #1 problem. The teacher recruitment crisis is the most urgent, important problem, I think, facing education. So thank you very much to Jack and Evelyn. Those are really interesting talks. So when Matt and his colleagues asked me to do this, my usual response when anyone asks me anything about teacher recruitment is say, go and talk to Jack, read what Jack has written. But I was slightly stumped since he's already spoken, it's already written. So what I'm going to do is I really just want to make 3 points, none of which unfortunately are the solution. It's always very tempting when you're looking at a problem in our own country to think, you know, this is due to factors in this country and the solution has to come from this country. but the teacher recruitment crisis is an international problem. And obviously different countries have it to different degrees. But there are other major countries that are also really suffering from a teacher recruitment crisis. So Germany, for example, Germany performed really quite badly in the recent international pupil assessment rankings that were published in December. And a lot of people in Germany are blaming their teacher shortage, their teacher crisis. There's a lot of not being able to fill vacancies, just as there is in this country. And there's also a huge amount of absenteeism of teachers from schools because of health issues, because in turn of overwork. About 40% of teachers work part-time. So I think people are trying to reduce their hours and trying to make their own work-life balance there. So some schools in Germany are going down to 4-day weeks. Some schools in Germany are recruiting people without teacher qualifications. People calculate that they need around tens of thousands more teachers than they currently have. And that's only going to get worse because their pupil numbers are also increasing, and also they're finally moving to a longer teaching day, be a bit more like the rest of countries. Globally, UNESCO have estimated that in order to hit the Sustainable Development Goal of universal basic education by 2030, around the world we need 69 million more teachers. So this, my point is to say that this is not just here. Doesn't make sense to look for explanations for this that only relate to this country. Again, in the International Student Assessment that came out in December, they also talk about this. They note that the availability of teachers to help students when they need that help, they need that bit of extra help, is highly correlated with the country's score in maths. So there is, just kind of emphasizing how much teachers matter. There's no direct measure of vacancies, unfilled vacancies, but school principals are asked about staff shortages. And there were, just in Europe, there were 16 countries for whom the number of principals reporting teacher shortages was higher than the UK, including France, Italy, Netherlands, Sweden, Germany, Greece, Hungary, Latvia. So it's a widespread problem. It's a widespread problem. And I think we also need to think that a teacher shortage is to do with not being able to, as Jack said right at the beginning, so the start off is the people joining teacher training courses and then filling vacancies. But we also need to think about teacher absence and as Evelyn alluded to, sort of this changing role of teachers to be much broader, to do with social welfare as much as to do with, or maybe nearly as much to do with education. So it's an international problem. We should think about, what are we doing to the teaching profession more broadly than just in England? And we need to think about and look to other places for solutions as well. Second thing to say is that, yes, the number of teachers in a school matters a great deal. At the margin, so the number of teachers matters, but also the effectiveness of those teachers. And there is, in some cases, and I'm not saying this applies to England completely right now, having effective teachers, more highly effective teachers, can balance to a degree the number of teachers. Now, there are very practical, everyday practical things about teacher numbers in schools that make a difference. So, rooms are a certain size for a certain number of pupils. You can't suddenly add another 10 pupils to a class in a very straightforward way. But in terms of sort of the research data on what matters for pupil attainment, the effectiveness of the teachers is way more important than the number of teachers. And as I say, the shortfalls in training are so large that, as Jack and his colleagues have highlighted, that we're not really operating at the margin here. These are really big shortfalls, and it means there are just things you can't do. So whether your plan was for everyone to do maths to age 18, or whether there's some new plan maybe coming with if we get a change of government, then there are just things that we can't do. But I would say that we do have to remember teacher effectiveness. And when we're thinking about the solution to teacher recruitment, teacher retention, we really must be very careful that we don't do anything that would jeopardize the average effectiveness of teachers in a school or in the country as a whole. Okay, and then my third and final thing is just a few thoughts about workload, because workload is mentioned globally, but is also mentioned particularly by teachers in England, as Jack and as others have shown. And so I think we have to agree that this is, you know, very definitely an issue in the problem. And there are different sorts of workload, and it may be that Jack or Evelyn can tell us in a few minutes about what aspects of workload appear to be the drivers of this too much workload. But and some of that will be undoubtedly administration, bureaucracy, and form filling. We all hate administration, bureaucracy, and form filling, and we all have too much of it to do. I suspect part of that is, without sounding like an old man, just the modern world. But, you know, I don't know. Maybe some of it can be got rid of. Although quite a lot of it, I think, is probably to do with pupil protection and pupil safeguarding. But I want to talk about another aspect of workload, and I'm at a total disadvantage here because I've never actually been a school teacher. And so whatever I say, Evelyn can come in and say, that's complete rubbish. No, that's completely wrong. But it seems to me that there is a lot of repetition in teaching. So think about lesson plans. You know, teachers every day are going to make a lesson plan for each class, and then tomorrow they're going to do the same. And there's a great deal of resistance within the profession to any idea of kind of, you know, repeating those, having common lesson plans, and having sort of bespoke lesson plans that you can pull off from the web or somewhere else, recycling lesson plans and so on. And I think these are to do with professional autonomy, that I'm a professional, that's my class is unique. I'm going to say what's the best way of teaching that class. And that's fine, I completely understand that. But there has to be a bit of a trade-off between that and, well, you know, if I used, you know, if our school had a set of common lesson plans, so for someone teaching science to 15-year-olds, by week 7, this is what you do, and you just, you know, use that, there would be quite a lot. So I think some of that came through the Oak Academy, which was set up during the pandemic, which seemed to me to be a really good idea. But I've noticed on Twitter that within the teaching profession, there seems to be quite a lot of antipathy to that, and I'm not really, I don't really sure I understand that. And then similarly, a couple of weeks ago, I think, the Education Endowment Foundation do sponsor a lot of research, a lot of really high quality research in education, announced that they were going to look at a trial where teachers' lesson plans would be helped with a little dose of AI to, again, to sort of try and speed the process up and try and remove a bit of workload, which, you know, we all want, I guess. And it's just a trial, you know, so we're some years off having anything actually working on that, even if it's shown to work. But again, there was quite a bit of resistance to that. And so while I completely agree that workload is a big problem for teachers, and this is said in every data set where people can say this, we need to think about the balance between that and professional autonomy. And maybe there's a few little gains we can do there. I'm not saying this is the main issue in workload, but it's one that I think might be addressable, whereas other ones might be harder to address. Okay, done.
That's fantastic, Simon. Thank you. That's really, again, given us food for thought. I think first thing is perhaps just on what the last point you're making there, maybe Evelyn could give some reflections from the kind of professional teacher side, just thinking about, the idea of, common lesson plans, why there's such kind of resistance to that. And whether there's a way forward and a kind of gain we can get there in reducing workload.
Yeah, thank you. I think I probably disagree slightly, Simon, in that common lesson plans are fairly common in many schools. There's more collaboration, and there's more of a sharing of ideas. And you know, an example would be, you know, in my school, my previous school, if I walked into any English lesson and we had year 7 on at the same time, I know that I would see a standard format. Obviously, there's nuances that the teacher might bring to the lesson, but actually, I would argue that there is more. There is more of that common sharing of lesson plans in schools. But the workload, I think, is a really interesting point. And I talk about this a lot in that I don't refer to workload in the, we're getting too many data drops, we're getting too many observations, so we've got to do all this planning. I think where the workload has become a real challenge for teachers and leaders is actually around the social, emotional and mental health aspect. I'd been teaching for many, many years, and never before, would I open a newspaper or hear on the radio that teachers will become responsible for brushing young people's teeth. Now, there is an argument around, is that the best place to do it? But, that's just one small example. The number of home visits, that more teachers and leaders are expected to do, more of the one-to-one, and really trying to hold our children in our schools. And for me, an answer would be, because the systems are just falling apart, CAMS is on its knees. And I also say, when I came into the profession, I was a history teacher. I'm a history teacher by trade. I don't know, I struggled when I had young people who were suffering from suicide ideation. And, I had to go and think, who can support me? So I think my point there is, if schools are going to be asked to do lots of this heavy lifting, we are going to have to be trained. And we're going to have some funds in our schools in order to do that. So for me, I totally agree with Simon around, let's really get under the skin of workload and what does that really mean? And I think it means something different post-COVID.
Yeah, I think that's chimes. Both of you have kind of mentioned something about the actual role of a teacher and the changing nature of the job, in that rather than just being educators, there's this kind of broader almost social work type element to the job. And I don't know if that is something, Jack, I don't know if this is something that's picked up in any of your work, in the sense that a lot of people have a vocation for teaching. Some of those positive things we're talking about at the beginning about the rewarding nature of the job, but at the same time are very aware, I'm not a social, how do I deal with a young person with that? So the job is changing, and is there a danger that this is part of what is leading to not enough people going into teacher training because of that aspect of the job becoming more prominent? What?
I think it's definitely come through our research recently. So we did a review, an evidence review on workload for Education Endowment Foundation, just to kind of understand what are the key drivers, what are the areas where teachers would like to see their workload reduced. And Simon's right, you do see a lot of teachers saying they spend too much time planning, but also when you get to really talk to teachers, I think they value the time that they spend preparing lessons and planning lessons. It's not necessarily planning, planning every lesson from scratch every time. I think it's about tweaking and adapting and being responsive to, well, how did the last lesson go? Did they understand it? Actually, if they didn't, maybe I need to tweak what I do in the next lesson. And so teaching is just a constant balancing act of kind of, keeping up with where kids are and bringing them along in terms of their learning and understanding. So you can have those kind of templates and that kind of, where we're going with the curriculum, but lesson to lesson that will then change. And teachers value that the professional autonomy that they have in terms of going on that journey with that class. I mean, the areas that did come up in that review as teachers really saying they needed support with reducing their workload, was things that often come up in terms of marking and admin. But top of the list, which I don't think I've seen it before, is this issue of behavioral management and pastoral support.
Yeah.
And when you kind of really dig into what teachers are saying there, schools are doing quite a lot to support teachers with their workload, but it's that external support they're receiving from elsewhere to support with those additional challenges, which teachers are trained to teach classes of 20, 30. To deal with those additional issues is a very different skill, is a very different thing, and it's not very conducive to classroom teaching. So it's something that needs to be needs that external support, and that came through very clearly in that research in terms of what's going on in schools at the moment after the pandemic, given all of the challenges that brought to young people, what they're coping with.
So I guess one of my questions was going to be around, if you are the new education minister coming in, and Simon, you mentioned about thinking what is the number one priority, and your work with Sandra McNally has suggested, okay, the teacher recruitment, that is the thing. I wonder if to some extent what also needs to be recruited is these staff to these support services, to CAMS, that sort of thing. Would that be a kind of, I don't know, almost equal priority to kind of get those staff up recruitment in that area in order to kind of then free up teachers? Or are we saying that actually the role of teacher is changing, and if you want to be a teacher, you're also going to be doing this kind of pastoral care support, social work type role? Is there a kind of like a fundamental choice there to be made about what we see teachers as going forward? Are we going to recruit the support staff, or are we going to kind of put that on teachers?
Is that a question to me?
That is, it's a question, that you can have first go on.
Well, I was just going to, it's a good question, and I think actually it's quite hopeful in the sense that if that is the biggest problem in workload, then does it? And I'm going to pass the question on to my right, to Jack. Does that not then offer a relatively easy solution, in the sense that we can stop each teacher doing that and have each school hire some people for whom that is their skill, and the teacher somehow can, such a problem arises with some of their children, they can pass them along to specific people, and then we'd be hiring people who weren't teachers to do jobs that aren't teaching, to free up the teachers to do teaching. And that seems much more straightforward and much more potentially feasible than scratching our heads and trying to figure out, why can't we hire more teachers?
Yeah, can I know you're passing that to Jack, but Evelyn, you look like you want to kind of
Evelyn again.
I do. I loved your bit around, if we had a new education minister come in. What I would say, it's not about mobile phones. We don't need to worry about mobile phones. The number one priority has got to be having staff in our schools. A, qualified teachers, and B, those trained staff to do, to support teachers with everything else. So, going back to your question, should we just have teachers teaching and non-teachers doing everything else? I actually think it's a bit of both. I think that, teachers play a valid role in the pastoral side, of nurturing and supporting our young people. But like I said earlier, we're not qualified. We don't have the skills for some of those challenges that I used to say are coming down the pipeline. Actually, they're writ large in our schools at the moment. So I do think it's a bit of both. And I think, yes, if we had more non-teaching staff to support with those challenges, that would be amazing. But again, we've got to pay them properly. Non-teaching staff can go and get a job in Lidl or Aldi and get paid, more than they would, your TAs who look after your most vulnerable young people in schools are leaving in droves. And we've already got an SEND crisis in our schools. But if we don't pay our staff, and show them the appreciation, and I said that a bit earlier. So for me, it really is about the teacher can do a dual role, but fundamentally we are teachers and we will carry some of that pastoral responsibility. But I do think that if we are going to ask our non-teaching staff to pick up that heavy lifting, we've got to pay them better, and we have got to celebrate and acknowledge the wonderful work that they do.
Absolutely, yeah, couldn't agree more with that. I'm aware we've got a lot of questions coming in, both in the chat and the Q&A. If possible, if they could mainly go in the Q&A, that would be helpful. But we'll try and get through some of these. We've got 20 minutes or so to think about them. And there's a couple that I'm going to come to you with, Jack. Thinking about the statistics that you mentioned at the beginning, Fiona asked, surely the government is privy to all these statistics. And a similar, I want to roll in a question from Elaine Wilson as well about whether it would help improve these statistics, I guess, if fees were waived for ITE, which is that initial teacher training? Yeah, education. Yeah, cool.
Yeah, so I mean, most of these figures that I spend my time kind of making into pretty charts and putting on Twitter are published by the government. So yeah, the government is very privy to these statistics and knows all the challenges. The government is at the moment going through a process of refreshing its strategy on teacher recruitment and retention from 2019. Kind of reviewing that in light of all of the changes that we've seen since, and I guess assessing the progress that has been since. So yes, the government knows this is an issue and knows it's a problem, and is focusing efforts on dealing with it. It's hard to achieve change when there's not that much money to spend. We talked about pay and what would be required to increase pay to the level needed to recruit enough teachers. It's very, very high, and as we are aware, the public finances are tricky. So it's always thinking about solutions that are good value for money. And I think that comes on to Elaine's question in terms of, well, what is good value for money in terms of solutions to this. And I think things that are focused on teacher training do offer quite high value for money. So we've just conducted a study looking at the impact of training bursaries. So if you're a teacher trainee coming into a PGCE in maths, then you attract a bursary of nearly £30,000 for doing that, which then can be paid against your fee and then give you kind of income while you're training. And these are really, really effective at improving recruitment. And the additional bit that we were able to look at using longitudinal data is also they're really, really effective at increasing that number of teachers that come into teacher training, and then they stay at the same rate as everyone else. So they're not taking the bursary and running. It is attracting more people into the profession who were considering the profession but weren't coming in. So it was enabling people to come in. And it turns out, pound for pound, it's a lot more effective than increasing pay across the board, which is something we need to kind of grapple with. In terms of, yes, there's been a reduction in pay, but that doesn't necessarily mean the solution is all in pay. I think these financial incentives are important, and similarly, waiving the fee would also be similar in some ways to a bursary in terms of increasing the financial attractiveness of coming into teaching, and therefore be good value for money and highly effective. So I think we should be looking at these solutions, particularly where they're focused on early career teachers who are very responsive to these kind of financial incentives, and who might make a different choice to follow the path into teaching or not, depending on that. And then we hope they make a long-term career of teaching in the end.
And thanks, Jack. And Evelyn, I wonder if that chimes with you. I've just thought about your comments earlier about teachers leaving to go abroad, and also you mentioned at the beginning about having to get supply teachers, cover teachers, which presumably ends up costing the school, costing the government more money, and therefore it's very similar, I think, to kind of NHS, where nurses shortages, and so you're paying private sector nurses, and that's a lot more expensive. And in terms of like a false economy of it's a false economy not to pay your kind of core staff, NHS staff, or your teachers more to retain them. But this point Jack makes about the bursaries, with that the younger teachers coming in, and then the kind of value of retaining them, is that something that you, from your experience, would ring true?
Yeah, I think it's one strand, and I think that we need to think what will help. And, we've spoken about the cost of living crisis, living in cities. London is so expensive. So I think it's a start, but I think we've then got to layer it with lots of other things, like, yes, you may get a bursary, but also that you're coming into one of the best professions, that is out there. But, until the teaching profession, and until, it's looked upon as a really as a great career, then actually a 28 grand, 30 grand bursary is going to maybe tempt some people, but I think they'll also be about retaining them, because yes, you kind of give them that kind of golden hello bursary, but actually once we've got them in the schools have got to be the best places for them to stay. And then that's when we go back to talking about workload, accountability system, and so on and so forth.
Thank you. There's a question here which I want to put to Simon, which is a very simple one, as whether the UK should consider a 4-day week. Now, I don't know, I presume this means just for teachers. I'd be very happy with a 4-day week for everybody else as well. But you mentioned that, Simon, as something that in I think you said in some schools in Germany, they're kind of going to a 4-day week. Do you see that sort of solution as being something we should be thinking about in England?
So, I mean, I don't know. I think that would be part of flexible working. So I think more and more institutions are offering their staff the possibility of working for compressed hours, which means slightly longer. Well, I'm sure everyone knows slightly longer days, but fewer days. So 4 days a week, if that simply means going down to 80% load, then I guess that's possible. If the idea is 80% load but 100% pay, then I think that's simply a pay rise, which is, as we've been discussing, absolutely necessary and absolutely great. So I'm not sure really what your questioner had in mind. More flexible working, I'm sure everybody loves. And we know from the pandemic, a lot of teachers were working at home. A lot of other teachers were working and doing their Zooming from schools. There was a mix of both, but it didn't work. I mean, it didn't work for the children. A lot of learning was lost with all of the implications of that. So I think Jack's absolutely right that kind of the idea of teachers teaching by Zoom from their own homes is currently not really a goer. So flexible working for teachers, I guess, would have to be shorter hours. And maybe shorter hours with the same pay would sound quite attractive and would be one way of doing a pay rise too.
Yeah, thank you, Simon. Yeah, that I think quite a few questions are coming in about that, thinking about flexible working and kind of workload, work conditions, that sort of thing. So that's answers some of those questions. I think one question following up a bit on what you were saying, Evelyn, is Chloe Bridson-Dommett asks, how much of an impact does the general public opinion have on the supply issue? Could changing the media narrative improve the situation? Again, it's quite similar to what we found with the NHS since the pandemic. We've gone from clapping outside the houses to you're not getting a pay rise, and that kind of, and the media narrative is quite interesting on that. And I think you've reflected on the image of teachers. Is that something that kind of, I don't know if the media narrative could be changed, could improve the supply situation?
Yeah, I do firmly believe that. I think that until, ministers who are responsible for the education, you know, can talk about the sector in a real positive way, and really engage with different parts of the sector in a productive way. I think until that happens, you're always going to have, you know, somebody up here who's being very, very negative about a sector. So if I'm a young, you know, if I'm a student, you know, and I've just finished, you know, my 3rd year at uni, and I'm thinking about, oh, should I go into teaching? And the message that's coming down is that actually we don't work hard enough, and maybe ministers work harder than us, and we should be saying thank you to them rather than them saying thank you to us. If that's a message that, you know, prospective teachers are getting, and then they, you know, they see an advert for a job, you know, I don't know, in a bank, you're a maths graduate and you see an advert in a bank, and, you know, that it's you know, the pay's more significant, the conditions are more significant, you know, they're going to go there as opposed to going to teaching. So I do think, you know, that the narrative that comes out about the profession, you know, like I said, there's lots of layers to this, isn't there? There's a potential bursary, there's potential looking at the workload, there's a potential narrative on the sector. But I think we just need to map all that out, and we need to bring it together, and kind of try not to do one or two things piecemeal. It's got to be a strategy around how are we really going to get more teachers into the profession, and how are we going to get them to stay? And I think all the bits we've spoken about today, they form part of the jigsaw. Put that together, and we would have, you know, first-class education system whereby, you know, teachers are not leaving, and our young people are getting the education they deserved, specifically, and more importantly, our more disadvantaged young people, and our more vulnerable young people, because they're the ones that are missing out right now.
Yeah, thanks, Evelyn. I think that's chimes with what you were saying, Jack, at the beginning, that whenever we have these kind of crises, it's not across the board effect. It impacts some communities, some schools, some socioeconomic groups more than others. So I wonder, there's a question from Naomi Hodgson who's asking, is this low public and political esteem in which teachers are held a particularly English issue, and how do we address it? You mentioned earlier, Simon, very a lot of information about this being an international issue, teacher shortages, and not just a uniquely kind of English thing. I wonder, I don't know, you know, if you know, do they have similar kind of, you know, the teaching profession, is it viewed more highly in some of our kind of European neighbours? I don't think it is in the US, but yeah.
So I could sense that one coming my way from when you first mentioned the word international. So I don't know. I don't know is the answer. So I can, you know, I can speculate away, but then so can we all. I think that teacher shortages are, you know, pretty common around European countries, and so I do wonder whether we are doing something to the profession that, you know, it has turned out to be not a good idea at all. And if different countries are doing similar things in terms of workload, work conditions, and pay, then, you know, this is all turning out very badly. One thing that, I mean, maybe in the chat, I don't know, I haven't looked, but we haven't talked about is behavior, and whether a lot of the if there's increasing uncertainty about becoming a teacher, whether maybe that's related to pupil behavior issues. I have no idea. I'm again looking to see if Jack has any answers on that. But I mean, so I would guess that similar countries have got similar views about the teaching profession. If there is a big shortage of teachers, it doesn't suggest a profession that everybody thinks, my goodness, I really want to be a teacher and be highly valued by my country. Doesn't really seem that way. But I have no facts on international media views of teaching.
I think there's other countries that face kind of different challenges as well. And I think it's important to think about that as well. Like some Southern European countries, I think Italy is one where they've actually looked after the teachers so well that now they have they didn't need that many coming into the profession because so few were leaving, and now they have an aging teaching population. They're going to just, the teaching population is reaching retirement age, and so they're going to face a real problem of then replacing them.
Can they come over to here?
Well, quite. We could work together on this, but it shows there's different challenges, and it's always difficult. You're always trying to find enough teachers and keep up with the demand, always changing, the supply always changing. Teaching is counter-cyclical, so it's always more difficult when the labour market is strong outside. And actually, we've glossed over quite quickly the fact that we did really rather well out of teachers recruiting into the profession during the pandemic, but that is much more difficult. We did the same during the financial crisis, so it does always make it more challenging given the economic conditions, and with an economic slowdown, hey, maybe things are going to get slightly easier and come back in our favor, but we've got to be doing all of those other things as well in terms of making it an attractive profession to join and to stay in. And I think the international evidence says we're not quite doing enough in this country, despite there being issues in other countries, that we could be doing a lot more to look after our workforce that other countries are doing as well.
Can I just say,
Please
the behaviour point, Simon, I think you're absolutely right. I think it's more about retaining, because it's teachers and non-teaching staff who are trying to cope with some of the challenging behaviours at the moment. And that is post-pandemic, and that is the cost of living crisis, and that is undiagnosed needs and not having, the appropriate funds to be able to meet the needs of all our children. So, what we hear at ASCL is definitely that behaviour is a massive concern for school and college leaders. And that is driving some people away, or is causing long-term absence of staff from schools because it is affecting their own mental health. So I think you're absolutely right, Simon, to raise the behaviour challenges.
I think so. I've got to say thank you to everybody who's putting these questions in the Q&A and the chat. We've got loads of questions. We've got only a couple of minutes left. So I think rather than going to try and quick fire answer a lot of these questions, perhaps I could just ask each of you for 1 minute to kind of give your final thoughts. We've had a lot of my mind is kind of slightly not able to hold together all the things that we've been talking about, all these different strands and aspects. There's lots of interesting questions that have been raised and answers that you've given. Maybe if you could give just a closing kind of comment on where you think we go from here. Now, maybe can I ask Jack first?
Yeah, sure. So I think, go back to one of the first questions. I think the government is thinking about this, and it's important to keep thinking about the solutions and encouraging them to be taken up. But we shouldn't kid ourselves that any solution is going to be free. I think we've talked about pay and financial incentives, which come with an obvious cost. But so we don't necessarily think, okay, let's go to resolving workload because that's free, because we talked about some of the solutions there in terms of the support services and supporting teachers with extra capacity. That costs money too. So I think there are solutions, but they require us to invest in the education system and to value it as highly as we say we do, in terms of the impact it has on young people, and making sure there's enough teachers in our classroom is just an essential part of that. So we should be looking at the solutions, both easy and radical.
Brilliant, thank you, Jack. And Evelyn, I come to you.
You can, but Jack's probably said everything I would have wanted to say, apart from, in addition, I would like to see government and ministers moving from thinking to concrete action. I'd like to see ministers engaging with, with us, the foot soldiers on the ground who live it and breathe it every day, you know, engage with us and then, you know, the wider sector. I agree that, you know, there isn't one solution. There are multiple solutions to the problem, but until ministers actually undertake this as a priority, it will be people like Jack, people like you and Simon running these, you know, these webinars as we continue to talk about it. But actually, we can only do so much. So I think it's about being very intentional with their thinking and put that into action.
Thank you, Evelyn. That's great. And Simon, sorry, I've given you the tough job of saying something that hasn't been said by Jack or Evelyn, but if anyone can do it, I'm sure you can.
Yeah, I thought I was going to be saved by the bell, but apparently not. So yeah, I have nothing else to say really. I mean, I think in terms of sort of the future prosperity and the future equality, social mobility of this country, nothing really matters more than the education of our young people. And we know from a lot of research that for the education of our young people, nothing matters more than teachers and teaching outside of the home and the family background. So it's incredibly important that someone takes a real grip on this and makes a bit of a dent in this problem. Jack's maybe right that the economic cycle will help us out by being bad. I don't know. It's not really something to hope for. But yeah, there isn't really a bigger problem facing the education community right now.
Well, thank you for those final words. I think we've been left with a lot of food for thought and a lot of challenge and things we will want to be bringing to policymakers. So at the IPR, and I know each of you are also engaging with policymakers, and so hopefully we can continue to have this on the agenda and try and make some positive changes to policy. On behalf of the IPR, I'd like to say thank you to our panelists, to Simon, to Evelyn, to Jack, for making this such a thought-provoking and fantastic event. Thank you to everyone who's joined us online, and particularly thank you for your questions. Sorry that we haven't been able to answer all of them. Hopefully we got through quite a good number. The webinar has been recorded, and the audio and video recordings will be made available soon. And to watch them, if you go to the IPR website, you'll be able to find that. And also previous events and information on upcoming events. So please do visit our website. Apologies, we've slightly run over, but it was too good to interrupt. So again, thank you to everyone for joining. Hope you'll join us again soon. For now, it's goodbye from the panelists and goodbye from myself, and we hope to see you again soon. Thank you very much.